Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our program this morning, our Lunch and Learn program. Today's focus, or our program, will be on weed and brush control. And if you have any questions, feel free just to. We have a chat box. If you're looking at your screen, you can go ahead and put some questions there. Or if you want to raise your hand, we'll acknowledge you. We will have the microphones turned down, but you can reactivate it by clicking the microphone. And if you want to ask a question, because a lot of these questions, as Megan will be, Dr. Clayton will be speaking, you can go ahead and chime in and ask that question. To focus on the topic area that she's on. So we will have this program till about 1 o'clock. I don't want to take too much time, but I will introduce myself. My name is Rolando Zamora. I'm the Cooperative Extension Program Ag and Natural Resource Agent located here in the Rio Grande Valley, here in Willacy County. And I oversee Cameron County as well. And today's topic is going to be on weed and brush control. As of now, we have had some rains down here in our area, and we're starting to see growth in our brush. And so there's some places also throughout the state that haven't seen too much rain and might have some weeds and such that are available for cattle to feed on and such. And some of these weeds could be toxic, and I guess Megan will mention a little information on that. So introducing our speaker, we have Dr. Megan Clayton. She's the professor and extension range specialist at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. She's located in the Corpus Christi area, and I will kick it off to you, Megan.
Great. Thank you so much, Ronnie, for the invite today. I'm excited to speak with you about a few different topics that Ronnie requested, which I think are very timely and great for us to go through. We'll talk about mesquite management. We'll talk about weed-satch management, and then we'll end with some information about toxic weeds and how all of this ties into the different weather conditions that we're experiencing across South Texas. If you did get rain recently, congratulations. If you didn't, I feel your pain. We are very dry too, but there's something to learn here for everybody. First, I want to talk about mesquite. Honey mesquite is the dominant plant species probably in most of Texas, but especially in South Texas. And it's in the legume family, which just means that it puts on a bean. It has compound leaves, which means that this leaf right here has leaflets. And then it has single straight thorns. So that's one way that you can tell it apart from another tree, such as weed-satch, because weed-satch will have tiny paired thorns as opposed to a single pin-like thorn. But honey mesquite can grow in different types. Sometimes it's a single stem, sometimes it's multi-stem. We're going to talk about how that kind of influences our ability to control it if we want to, and when we should maybe be controlling it. So first, is honey mesquite native to Texas? Anybody want to type in the chat box a guess? Yes, no, or are you unsure about that? I'll give you just a minute to find the chat box, and that's also where you're going to put any questions that you have for us. Pamela says yes, it is native. You're absolutely correct, Pamela. Honey mesquite is a native. It's been recorded for many centuries to be existing here, and maybe it didn't grow in the same density or the same range that it does today, but by all means, it is a very native part of Texas. We use it, the food can be used as, the beans can be used as a food item. The wood can be used as firewood, fence posts, beautiful furniture, even flooring. So a lot of different ways that we have used mesquite in the past. Texas is well known for having a great mesquite population. It provides excellent shade for livestock, especially those larger, we call them kind of bull mesquites. They're allowed to grow into maturity. And then, of course, there's a lot of wildlife uses from food and cover. And we're going to talk about some other features because of this legume plant that provides to our landscapes. So from a wildlife standpoint, white-tailed deer and butterflies, bees, and insects use the honey mesquite tree as forage, whereas pretty much everything will eat a bean on a honey mesquite plant. Of course, a lot of birds and small mammals would seek out mesquite for protection, for nesting sites, or even as roosting. A lot of times we think of something like a wild turkey that's so large as roosting in large oak trees or something that's a little bit more sturdy, but where there's a lack of larger trees, even medium-sized honey mesquite trees, I've seen turkeys roosting in, kind of holding on for dear life in the wind, but they will utilize them for those purposes. So seeds, a lot of people tell me, man, I've got seeds from mesquite on my place, and so I'm going to have mesquite coming up forever. Part of that statement is very true. Part's a little bit misleading because we have been able to, in an herbarium under perfect conditions, keep a honey mesquite seed for 50 years and then that germinate. But in nature, we're really looking at about a year. So after about a year, about 95 to 99% of those seeds can no longer germinate. Seeds planted did not emerge after 6 years, but of those that lived, 79% came up in the first year. So we know that the crop, the bean crop that you're seeing, and a lot of times mesquite will put on more beans as an adaptation during drought times to really take advantage of the bare ground that's available. These beans will either come up this year and you'll see them sprout, or you won't. So it's not something that's going to naturally live in your soil for very long. And then seeds that we do see drop to the ground, those beans that'll drop to the ground, usually disappear within 3 to 5 weeks because, as we saw on the previous slide, everything eats them. It's really a great forage resource. So to germinate under ideal conditions, it needs to be in the 80s, covered with just a tiny bit of soil, good seed to soil contact. Light is not necessary. So keep that in mind, that you don't necessarily have to have a big, huge open bare ground area in order to germinate honey mesquite, but it does need to be free of grass. So where you have thick grass, you're giving yourself insurance that you're not going to have a lot of brush come up, which is a really good take-home point for today. So the establishment of these plants to where they'll grow into seedlings is typically between 80 and 90 degrees. The seedlings do need light because, remember, with those leaves they put on, they're looking at doing some photosynthesis, which is necessary with light on those green leaf materials. And then you need moist soil for about 3 to 5 days in order for those plants to really germinate and get a good start. So this is a site in Spur, Texas, where a project was done where they went in and removed all of the honey mesquite that came up on the property in regular intervals throughout time. So you can see every few years, 5 to 7 years, they would remove whatever seedlings were there. What's interesting is that they're mechanically removed and there were no livestock grazing taking place on this property. And so all of these seeds were brought in by wildlife, right? So even if you do your best to keep your livestock from eating and transplanting these seeds, wildlife are still bringing them into your property. And that's why you feel like you're constantly fighting brush, because you are constantly fighting brush. So the single best thing that we can do to reduce the impact of brush on our property is, 1, remove unwanted brush, but also 2, keep a good coverage of grass on our property through proper grazing management in order to eliminate the ability of these seeds to even germinate that year. So over that 25-year period, they removed 689 plants, and 69% of those were just seedlings. So really important take-home message that you have the ability to manage your forage, which can reduce the amount of seeds that come in, but you can't stop seeds from coming in. Wildlife's going to continuously breed them, bring them. So juvenile plants, it's their first critical 2 to 3 years. They don't flower or produce seed. And sometimes you've probably noticed this, especially maybe in hay fields that you let go for a little bit too long. Those seedlings come up and they're not the ones that are flowering out or producing the beans. But remember that tree height does not necessarily indicate the age of the plant. Because a lot of times if we're shredding that plant or we're doing a prescribed fire or something that's going to top kill the plant, that root system is very much alive underneath the soil surface, and that tree is going to continue to grow, probably with multiple sprouts. And we'll look at why that is. So once it gets to a mature tree, a lot of times you see two different growth forms. One would be a single stem growth form, which means that that plant has not been altered in any way. So it has not been shredded, it has not been burned, it has not been top killed by maybe the incorrect chemical applied. Whereas this bottom one, which we're probably all familiar with, is a multi-stem mesquite tree that all joins up those stems underneath the soil surface in an area I call the saddle, where they all finally come back together to a single root system. And that root system is the same age as the original seedling tree that was coming up. So it may not look very big above ground, but that root system may be huge. So we know that mesquite roots are very extensive. We've heard this throughout time. Mesquite puts out a long taproot that goes very deep into the soil, but they also have lateral roots that go out from that plant. And typically we have the bud zone, or the area that can sprout out new stems, in that first 18 inches or so. And then underneath of that, where the first lateral roots start coming out, is a really extensive network that's not only drawing moisture from your grasses where those grass roots can reach, but below that section as well. So we know that mesquite are a legume. That means they make beans, and they have the ability to do nitrogen fixation, which means that the mesquite components, such as the leaves or the nodules in the roots that are feeding these leaves, is making a very nitrogen rich product. And then when that is falling to the ground, the leaves fall to the ground, or when an animal eats the leaves or the beans and then it defecates underneath the tree, that is when it adds nitrogen into the soil. So it's not exactly those nodules pumping nitrogen into the soil. It's that the components of that tree are high in nitrogen, and that's added back into the soil, and it makes a very nitrogen rich environment. A lot of times you might see more diversity of trees growing underneath mesquite trees. This is why, because that mesquite tree has changed the soil to where it's much richer in nutrients. And so those plants that can't make those nutrients on their own are benefiting from what that mesquite tree did. So it kind of makes sense, right? Where we see mottes of mixed brush, it's because they're all clustering where that mesquite has made the nitrogen rich environment in the soil. So small mesquite aren't necessarily big nitrogen fixers. They don't add a whole lot to the soil, but there's significantly higher nitrogen and carbon levels found underneath the mature mesquites compared to the open spaces right in between the mesquite trees that are growing on the same area. So dense stands of smaller mesquite should be thinned, because we know that they're not doing anything as far as benefiting your land by providing a whole lot of nitrogen fixation, but they are competing with the sunlight and water that you want to go towards your forages more likely. So at what percent canopy cover would you consider mesquite to be a competition with grasses? Do you think 20% is too much? Would you go 35, 50, more than 50? Or do you feel like your grasses and your mesquite are never in direct competition with each other? Just type a letter into the chat box if you would. Okay, I got an A and a B, both great guesses. B, C, okay. Well, at 20% canopy cover, which means if we took an aerial shot, like a bird's eye view of your place, if mesquite is covering up at least 20% of your property, it is in direct competition with your grass production. We know that measurements at about 11% canopy cover are not. So at just 20%, we know that we're losing out on some of our forage availability because of the fact of mesquite being there through research where it's documented this number. So you can see that we saw that picture where all those lateral roots were taking some of the nutrients and the soil moisture from grasses. But even below that, where most grass roots could even be used, there's an extensive root system that's keeping this tree alive. And that's why even when we have severe drought, we're still able, for the most part, to spray honey mesquite with herbicides because these plants are relatively unaffected. We might see some indirect effects, such as insects feeding more on honey mesquite during those times because there's not a lot else green available, but most definitely the trees thrive. But you can see that even below 3 feet, there's a lot of reserve from those roots that are reaching down from that taproot. So grass production. On the flip side, honey mesquite could also, in small amounts, be beneficial for grass production. I think we've all seen scenarios like this where we have a lot of grasses growing right underneath the brush. They provide shade, which keeps that harsh sunlight off of our grass plants. It's also provided that nitrogen, so a real nutrient-rich environment, and it's moderating those soil temperatures as well. So all of these things are helping to create kind of a micro environment underneath our mesquite trees that might actually support more forage growth, especially in South Texas, where our weather conditions can be really harsh. All right, so the target, what we really want to try to treat are seedlings so that we don't get to the point where we have large mesquite trees that we're trying to control. So even if you're thinking you need to do some broadcast control options to get that mesquite down to a workable number, our ultimate goal is to try to treat those seedlings to make sure that they work out. We get rid of those before we get to that point. There's no seeds produced yet. Remember, those younger trees, 1 to 3 years, they're not flowering, they're not producing beans, and they're cheaper to treat because they're a much smaller tree structure. We're always looking towards treating the bud zone of the plant. And I alluded to this earlier, but if you picture the soil surface at the top of that picture right here, underneath that, there's all these little wart-like looking structures. Those are buds. And when that single stem mesquite is still up, that stem is actually keeping those buds from sprouting by producing a hormone called auxin. And once that top is removed, whether you're shredding them or burning them or putting on the wrong herbicide, you're removing that top and it's allowing that hormone to no longer be suppressing those buds. And boom, a single stem tree becomes a multi-stem tree very quickly. So these buds go all the way down to where the first lateral roots come out on a mesquite tree. So this bud zone is our target no matter what we're doing. If we're doing a mechanical treatment, if we're doing a chemical treatment as a leaf stem or a cut stump, that's the area we're trying to get that chemical to in order to actually kill the tree. So we know we can do prescribed fire, and that might control trees that are a year old or so. But once that tree gets a little bit of age to it, the growing point, or those buds, actually drop below the soil surface, and the fire tends to not get hot enough to control those trees. So that's why many research projects, even with a high fuel load, have not proven to control very many trees, although prescribed fire might suppress the trees, kind of knock them back a little bit, but more than likely they'll be back. Chemical control options, we have a lot that are really effective. Honey mesquite has been widely studied for herbicide applications. We have mechanical control options like grubbing out those trees to get that bud zone out of the ground so that plant can't resprout. And then of course, biological control, where we might have animals, which cattle also will eat honey mesquite, but goats or sheep that might graze more heavily on that plant could suppress it, although they're not removing that bud zone. So it's going to constantly be growing back from those buds underneath the soil surface. So this is what we mean by growing back from those buds. And this area kind of looks like a burn has gone through it, judging by the way that plant looks and how green that short grass is coming back. But these little resprouts at the base are coming off of those buds underneath that stem. So very small tree, very, very small tree, but a huge root system underneath the ground. The same right here. This tree looks like it was probably burned. And then all of these little resprouts right here are tied to that same original root system. So for broadcast, we can do aerial applications with a plane or a fixed wing, a fixed wing plane or a rotocopter, a helicopter. And then we could also some people do root plowing where they drop a plow into the ground and they're cutting off those stems about 18 inches deep to make sure they get all of that bud zone. Or we could do broadcast chemical applications by ground, as long as you can get your boom or your boomless nozzle at least 18 inches above the tallest part of the tallest plant to get good coverage on that plant. And then we have some individual plant treatment options, including grubbing, where we would pull those plants out one at a time, shearing, where we would cut that tree off and then spray that remaining cut stump with a chemical application, or spraying the leaves or the stems of those plants with like a backpack sprayer or a spray rig with a hand wand. So again, here's our mechanical options. You could grub out individual plants. They took out a lot of root here, but that's not necessarily something you'd have to do. You just have to get the buds out of the ground. This is an example of a root plow that might be dropped down to cut off those stems underneath the soil surface. Or let's not forget, if you only have a few trees or a few seedlings popping up in the pasture, this is just a sharpshooter shovel that's been sharpened on the end. You can get down there and hack that tree out below that growing point, which on a seedling tree is very high. You can chop that off and then that tree will not come back. For chemical applications, we have leaf sprays that are typically done getting to be about this time of year, kind of late spring, early summer time frame. Soil temperatures need to be at least 75 degrees at 12 inches deep, which I think it's safe to say we're already there. But there's a lot of other characteristics we're looking to make sure all the stars align and it's the right time to spray that plant. We have a little guide that says after bud break, then you can start spraying 45 to 90 days later. That is a very large window, and it's honestly not very helpful for me when I'm deciding when to do my applications. What is very helpful is that all the leaves need to be a dark green color. No new growth could be on those plants. So if you caught some of these recent rainfall events, your trees likely put on a few inches of new growth, and that might be a limey green color, and the rest of your tree might be dark green. But you want to wait until that entire tree is a dark green color. That way, you know that tree is storing its carbohydrates or its sugars in the bud zone. Why is that important? Well, we're spraying the leaves in order for that tree to take that chemical down with the carbohydrates to the roots to kill that tree. So you've got to have the tree that's actively moving carbohydrates downwards so that they'll consistently move your chemical down with it. Another thing is, here's an example. So here's a limey green tree. This is what they look like when they first come out in the spring. Or again, it'll be limey green just on the end when we get new rainfall events. And then it takes usually a couple of weeks before that tree will turn a dark green color again. And here's an example of a tree that's pretty much dark green, although I do see a little bit of limey green new growth coming out on it. So you can see like right here and right here. But you want everything to be a dark green color before you spray to ensure the consistent movement of that chemical down to the bud zone to kill the plant. Additionally, you want healthy leaves. So you don't want dried up leaves from drought stress, and you don't want insect damage. And that's kind of one of those weird balances we do right now. So I plan to spray as soon as all the leaves look healthy and are dark green, and they're not putting on a bean, elongating a bean, and they're not flowering. That way that tree is ready to take my chemical down to the root zone. And if anything else is going on, then I'm going to wait. In fact, one site that I'm looking to spray in McMullen County currently has new growth on the ends from the rainfall that they received. So we're just waiting. And as soon as that's dark green, I'm going to start spraying, because we risk these insects coming in and potentially taking a lot of our leaf that we need to take in the chemical. So we want to make sure to spray it as soon as all those stars align. If you mechanically mowed the trees and they're just coming back, you want to make sure they're at least 3 feet tall so they have enough leaf on them to take in enough chemical to kill that root zone. So aerially, if you spray with a fixed wing or a helicopter, you'll want to put out 4 to 5 gallons of mix per acre. If you're doing an application where you have a lot of different stem numbers, be aware that the more stems you have, the lower your control will be. So here in this example study, when they had 1 or 2 stems, they were able to kill 85% of the trees. With 3 to 5 stems, 63%, and with more than 6 stems, only 41% of the tree. A lot of that has to do with the ability to consistently move that chemical down to the buds and not miss a bud that might be aligned in between those stems where they all come together. And so it's just a factor of the physiology or the structure of that tree and not being able to get chemical to all of the buds. The height of the tree also matters. So we know that if we have less than about a 6.5, 7 foot tree, then we can get better control, 76 or 74% in this particular study, than in 6.5 feet and over, which they got 59%. And that has to do with being able to consistently cover all of those leaves until they're wet but not dripping without them being shaded by leaves above. And so once you get a taller tree, it's a little bit more difficult to get perfect coverage. So from ground broadcast, you can spray with a boom. Again, if you can get that at least 18 inches over the tallest part of the tallest plant you're trying to control. You can do it with boomless nozzles like these brush busters that are spraying out from the center, and they spray an arc about 16 to 20 feet each, or you can use something like this cluster jet nozzle. But regardless, you've got to make sure that this is tall enough to get that spray over your plants that you're trying to control. When you're individually spraying, I like to use a backpack sprayer, or you can use a rig that's on something that's maneuverable, so you don't have to actually carry that spray mix on you, but it would still have a hand wand and work in much the same way. We suggest a Cone Jet X8 nozzle for a mesquite leaf spray with a check screen or a mesh screen or check valve behind that, and that's just keeping that nozzle from clogging up. And when you let go of the handle, it'll keep it from dripping on you when you're finished spraying. X8 is a fairly big hole, and that's on purpose. We want a big pattern to go out to cover all of those leaves until they're wet but not dripping. So the leaf spray mix is going to be the chemical that you have chosen to use for honey mesquite, diluted always in water. Never add diesel, because that's going to make that defoliate the leaves faster, which you don't want. You want the chemical to sit on that leaf and be taken in. And then you're going to add in a surfactant, and a surfactant is cutting that surface tension. So it's the difference between these balls, drops on the leaf, and this smoothed out. So in this picture, it's got surfactant, and so that's cut the surface tension that's allowed the chemical to get into the leaf more easily. And then we also add in a blue dye, only about 1/2 ounce per gallon of mix, but that really helps to mark and make sure that you've covered all of those leaves when you're doing individual plant treatments. So we used to use Remedy Reclaim on honey mesquite, and then that was replaced with Sendero. Sendero is a couple of active ingredients that have been bottled up, put out by Corteva, and Sendero works very effectively as an individual plant treatment method at 1%, or as a broadcast method at 28 ounces per acre. And then more recently, Bayer released Invora. Invora is a fantastic chemical that works at 1.5%, or 24 to 36 ounces per acre on honey mesquite. And Invora is a really interesting new chemistry. It's aminocyclopyrrolachlor, which is something new in range and pasture. And we are going to talk a little bit more about Invora a little later with Weesatch as well. But you can see back when we still used Remedy Reclaim, these are a lot of aerial trials that were compared to what now is called Invora in orange. So you can see that Remedy Reclaim was 64%, Invora 96%, Remedy Reclaim 59%, Invora 80%. Anyway, you can see how we're getting a lot higher efficacy and also a little bit of longevity for those sites as far as long-term control of these plants using the new Envora chemical. But your cheapest one for for individual plant treatment right now is going to be Sendero at 1%. And if you used Envora, it's going to have to be 1.5%. All right, so here's what I mean by kind of some longevity of your control with Envora. When they put out some broadcast trials, 5 trials that have been summarized, 3 years after the initial treatment, they went back and looked at these sites. And Envora had about a 2.5% canopy cover of Weesach versus a 30% canopy cover on the other treatments that were used. And then specifically to honey mesquite, they had 10 trials, and 8.5 years later, so they had a little bit longer time since the trials were put out. Envora still only had 2% canopy cover of mesquite and 25% canopy cover in those sites where other treatments were used. So for a stem or a basal spray, this is a really great technique. One, if you have seedling trees or less than 3 stems per treatment, and 2, if you've got grass that's lower or has been recently grazed, because then you'll be able to reach that stem a lot easier. You really want to do it on smooth bark with diameters of less than 4 inches if you were to cut that tree off and measure it. Otherwise, it's getting a little bit hard to get that into the tree bark. So when you do a basal spray, you're going to spray about 12 to 18 inches high all the way around. So I usually spray one side of the tree and literally walk around to the other side of the tree and spray that. We suggest a cone jet X1, X2, or X3. If you're really impatient, you can use an X3. These have very small holes. And that's because you want a stream to go out onto those trees. So you're saving a lot of your chemical mix as opposed to like an X8 for leaf sprays that's putting out a very wide pattern. And again, make sure you use a mesh screener check valve behind that. And that's especially important when you're using diesel, because a lot of times that tends to get clogged a little bit more easily. So here's some examples. This plant is not really big enough to spray. But once it gets a little bit more of a woody bark to it, stem spray would be a good option. In this case, only one side of the tree was sprayed. And of course that won't work because it's not going to move around the plant. You have to spray every stem that's on that plant in order for it to be effective. For a stem mix, it's going to be different than our chemical in water like we were using for our leaf applications. This is going to be usually a triclopyr such as Remedy Ultra and diesel. And so we would put in, I suggest 25% Remedy Ultra, 75% diesel, or 1 quart to 3 quarts. And that'll allow you to do any size stem you come up on. If you only have seedling trees that you're treating, you can get away with using 15% of the chemical, 85% diesel. I always add in a blue dye. It's only 0.25%. It's like 0.3 ounces per gallon of mix, not very much, and it's totally worth it to make sure you've sprayed that stem well. But you wouldn't need a surfactant because your diesel is what's getting that chemical mix into the bark. You need to leave a leaf or a stem application there for 1 full year before you remove that plant, preferably 2 if you can stand it. And so that's the reason a lot of people choose to do a cut stump method, because you don't have to look at those trees standing or those skeletons standing for a full year. Cut stump is where you're going to remove that tree as low and as flat to the ground as possible, and then spray that remaining cut stump and any remaining stem. So cut stump is really your only option. If you're treating trees in a hay field, you can cut them really low and you can still do your haying that year. Otherwise, you're going to be skipping your ability to hay for a full year if you do a leaf or a stem spray. So cut stump can be done any time of year. I think that's a huge advantage. Stem spray can pretty much be done any time of year. We say it's best when the tree's actively growing, which is most of the year in South Texas. You can do any size tree with a cut stump. And of course, it's more labor intensive because you're removing that tree up front. But again, you don't have to look at the skeleton standing there in the field. So you'll remove it either with a shear or a chainsaw. My favorite thing right now is this brush cutter, which is like a weed eater with a brush attachment blade on the end. It can cut through about a 2.5 to 3 inch diameter tree like butter. That's a good way not to have to bend over all of the time and get a really flat cut. And then hopefully you could have a team so that somebody else is with you spraying that immediately after your application. So this is a poor example of doing cut stump. They cut a bunch of stems really high. They're going to have to treat all the tops of these trees plus the remaining stem. This is a much better scenario where you have a single stem tree. They've cut it off, and then he can treat the top of that and just kind of hit the stem that's left. So this looks like it was probably cut at an angle, and the chemical likely ran off of that high side. And so that tree regrew from that side. A lot of times I go to people's places and they say, we did cut stump, it worked really well, but now we have all these seedlings coming back. Well, it's not a seedling. We know that because it has multiple stems, right? And a seedling plant would have a single stem on a mesquite. So this is an example of what will happen if it's not sprayed correctly, or if you cut it so low that dirt gets on that cut stump surface and the chemical is just not allowed to get in good contact with the stump. Then you might see some resprouting like this. So the mix for cut stump is just like stem spray. You're going to do a triclopyr, which you would only need 15% because you're really opening up that entire cut wound, and 85% diesel. And again, add in your blue dye to mark that you've already treated that tree and to make sure you cover that entire cut stump surface really well. So for mesquite management, the points you should take home are to establish long-term goals, because mesquite is not a one and done species, as you all know. Eradication is not possible, so we're aiming for management to maximize our use of the land or to meet our goals for that property. Target the smaller, younger trees because we're more effective at controlling them, and you avoid getting to that situation to where you have a tall or a multi-stem tree to deal with. Beware of shredding because that creates multi-stem plants that we know are harder to control. Maintain proper grass coverage, and this is going to discourage your mesquite establishment. Remember, mesquite seeds typically live for 1 year or less. And so you're not going to see a lot of store up of these seeds and them coming up over the years. It's going to be what is contributed that year. So now I'm going to switch over to weesach ecology. Weesach is another one of our problem species we have down here. It typically grows on more clayey soils or more coarse soils, more fine soils. And these are distinguished from twisted acacia by a couple of things. Usually their growth form is more of a tree, and twisted acacia is more of a bush. But once you shred quite a bit, it's kind of hard to tell the difference there. Twisted acacia tends to have a darker bark. But again, if you don't have both growing in your pastures, that might not be a definitive answer. The one thing I've found that's very definitive for telling apart mesquite from twisted acacia is the presence of a gland just below its lower leaflets. So if I went up to the tree and I pulled off a leaf, which includes all these leaflets, right? You pull off a leaf, and at the base, there's going to be a little black dot. You'll see it. It's on this rachis, or the stem that's holding all these leaflets together. If that's lower, that's a weesach leaf. If it's right in between the bottom leaflets, that's twisted acacia. So I think of it in my head like, if I twisted those leaflets at the bottom around, would it cover up that gland? And if it doesn't, then you're dealing with weesach, not twisted acacia. I hope that makes sense. They're distant cousins, but they look an awful lot alike. And typically we treat twisted acacia during a mesquite timing with mixed brush, and weesach we typically treat in the fall. So it's important to know what you're dealing with. So is weesach, even though it's a legume, is it a big nitrogen fixer? It grows really fast, and it grows so fast that it's shading out the ground before it contributes enough nitrogen to help anything else grow. So typically, we don't see the same nitrogen addition to our soils that we see from mesquite with a weesach tree. So we don't see weesach as a huge benefit to your landscape. For seeding, 70% of the seeds germinate usually within 24 hours once optimal conditions have been met. They do need significant amount of moisture, and I think that's why a lot of times you see Weisach in heavier clay soils, because it'll hold moisture a little bit more than our sandy soils will, or you'll see them a lot in low-lying areas or in close to water, because they are kind of a water-loving species, and they also do best when the temperatures are in their 80s. So more seedlings, we know, emerge on sites that are sunny and mowed often. So that would also include sites that are sunny and graze too hard. So we have to be very cognizant, just like with mesquite, that we're grazing appropriately and not taking too much leaf material away, because that is encouraging these Weisach trees to sprout. For grass production, warm and cool season grasses decline if you have more than 30% canopy cover of Weisach. So again, if you're looking aerially like a bird down on your land, if 30% is covered with Weisach trees, it is directly affecting the amount of grass that you're able to grow on that property. So we know that the leaves are where they're doing photosynthesis, because that's how we time our application of chemicals. Again, here's a Weisach tree. It is twice compounded leaves. So remember mesquite, we said they're compounded. So one leaf has leaflets. Weisach, one leaf has leaflets, and those leaflets split again. So Weisach has a ton of leaf coverage area, but it's very small. And so that's one reason that we have trouble controlling Weisach, is that it's hard to get good coverage of all those little bitty tiny leaves. And again, here's that gland down low. And if that gland were right here in between the bottom leaflets, what tree would that be? Twisted acacia, right? Weisachio. All right, so bud zones of the stem. It's the same as mesquite. That's what we're looking at, is those buds that are underneath the soil surface. And even if you have multiple stems somewhere under the soil surface, they all come together and they join to a similar stem that has those buds. So that's still our target when we're treating Weisach, just like we talked about with mesquite. So for cut stump, the same concept as we just talked about for mesquite, so we can save some time here. We're spraying that entire cut stump surface, because we're getting especially that white ring around the outside. That's where that xylem and phloem are transporting water and minerals up and down the plant. And we're trying to kill that area and have that move down to our bud zone when they're moving those materials back and forth. So we know through studies that you need to treat the tree immediately. I'm going to skip over a lot of the details of this study, but what we know is even after 15 minutes of cutting that tree off, your efficacy or your ability to control that tree drastically drops. And so you've got to spray immediately after you cut. Also, if you're like me, you can't find a lot of those trees if you have any grass, if you cut a bunch and try to go back and find them. Okay, leaf spray timing considerations. One is the soil temperature. Just like with mesquite, we need to have at least 75 degrees, 12 inches deep, and that goes for in the fall. We don't want it to get too cool, or else we should probably stop spraying. Tavini, it's a guy who did his master's research on Weisach trees along the coastal area, and he said the optimum temperature was 76 degrees Fahrenheit, but he got good control for ranges 68 all the way to 86. So you have a little bit of leeway there. If your land is near the coast, the water temperature in the bay is actually a little bit correspondent to the 12 inches deep soil temperature. So that might be one way. If you're not a nerd like me and run around with a soil thermometer in your truck, that's another way for you to tell. So carbohydrate movement. We know that Tavini, when he was doing a study where he was spraying individual plants, he found that there was carbohydrate movement. So it would move our chemical too down to the soil in both May and October. But a lot of times in May, like now, we're dry and Weisach leaves are not in the best condition. If they are, you might get away with spraying Weisach with an individual plant treatment method when you're spraying your mesquite. But if those leaves don't look too good, I would wait until October for sure before you spray them. If you're spraying both individual plant treatment during a mesquite timing, you can use Sendero at 1% on both trees. If you're spraying just in October for only Weesatch, because mesquite are not good to spray in October, then I would spray with Grazon P plus D at 1% if you have a pesticide license. And if you don't, then I would spray with the Sendero at 1%. The only reason for that is that Grazon P plus D works on Weesatch and it's cheaper. Hope that makes sense. So again, we're looking for that leaf to be a dark green color. So just like here, we've got some new growth. Oftentimes the leaves even look a little bit weird while they're still coming out. We want that new growth to be fully mature before we spray. So if I could zoom in right here, here's some new growth of Weesatch. Can y'all see that? The leaves look like they're still pressed together and they're a limier green color than the rest of these leaves. So you really want to wait until everything is mature before you spray it. So flowering and beaning. These are 2 times of the year that you want to make sure you're not spraying the trees, because at those times the tree are using their efforts of growing the beans or flowering and not taking their carbohydrates down to the roots to store them. So it doesn't do you much good to spray any brush species when it's flowering or beaning. So plant height, just like with mesquite, we know that under 7 feet tall is a lot easier to control than over 7 feet tall. For plant height, you can see here's all the different sites where we sprayed, and we categorized what height each tree was. Over 7 feet tall had anywhere from 22 to about 65% control, whereas under 7 feet tall had anywhere from 65 to about 83% control. So much better in our studies when we have shorter trees. Here's a picture just to kind of ingrain this into your head, just like we talked about with mesquite. Here's shorter Weesatch, totally controlled. Here's larger Weesatch, just not. And this is because this canopy was so dense, it was hard to get that chemical into that canopy. And so a lot of that leafed back out. It was in the middle of the trees. So the growth form of the tree matters too. A single stem plant like this one will always be easier to control than a multi-stem plant like you see over here on the right. For cumulative rainfall, the initial study was an individual plant treatment study done in Kinney County, where they did the same exact individual plant treatment methods 3 years in a row, and they got anywhere from 80-something%, 90-something%, but in 2000 they only got 20% control. So they looked back, what's going on here? Turns out that the rainfall was, about 3.25 inches or 4.5 inches on the years that they got good control, and only 0.25 inches or so that year that they had bad control. So they knew that control of Weesatch was highly dependent on having soil moisture at the time of spraying. We did a lot of work looking at how much rain you actually need to effectively control Weesatch. Tavini, that grad student who worked down here, found that 2, 4, and 8-week cumulative rainfall, or the total amount you got before you sprayed, had a positive effect on Weesatch mortality. What Dr. Lyons and I found in our studies, we did ground broadcasts, so we were broadcasting, not individual plant treatments like this study. We found that 2 weeks before or 4 weeks before really mattered. So you needed about 2 to 3 inches cumulatively the 2 weeks before you sprayed Weesatch, or you needed 4 inches of rainfall cumulatively the month before you sprayed Weesatch in order to get good control. So this can really help you make management decisions during drought years or years like this where we get a little rainfall and then we don't. If you have the correct amount of moisture coming up on October, then it might be a good year for you to spray. If you don't, it may not be worth your efforts to spray Weesatch if you're incredibly dry, because we know that you're not going to get control even if you spray at the right timing with the right chemical. So again, Weesatch, just like mesquite, we can do a leaf, stem, or a cut stump treatment on it. The leaf spray for Weesatch is best in the fall. Again, there are those small situations where you can get away with individual plant treatments earlier in the year, like a May timeframe. We suggest graze on P+D at 1% as the cheapest control option. Sendero at 1% if you do not have a pesticide applicator's license, or Invora at 1.5%. And then broadcast, the only chemical that we have a very high control rating on, being 76 to 100% control broadcasted, is Invora at 36 to 48 ounces per acre. So that is a new treatment from a new chemical where we finally have something that we can broadcast on Weesatch and control it, which is very exciting. So this is the same study I showed you earlier, that there seems to be some long-term control too to spraying Invora on our brushy pastures. So this Invora, it's actually aminocyclopyr with a triclopyr amine, so a different formulation from Remedy Ultra. It was issued the grazing label in 2020, but it is a restricted herbicide. It's available now in 1 gallon drums, or usually for applicators in 30-gallon drums. So you do need a picolinic acid training in order to apply Invora. They won't ask you for this certificate when you purchase it, but if you're audited by TDA, you need to have had it in order to apply. And then you repeat the training every 2 years, much like the dicamba training that we're used to in the farm world. So you can take this training through AgriLife Extension. We offer it quite frequently, or you can go online, and we have an online course at agrilifelearn.tamu.edu, where you can, I think you pay $15 and you can take that 1 hour course, take a little test at the end, and get your certificate. The certificate is also good for 1 hour of laws and regs. But if that's something you need, let your county agents know, and we can set up a time to do that training for you too. So you can use Invora on privately owned land that is not hayed. So you cannot put this on your hay lands, or you're not allowed to remove that hay for 2 full years. We cannot move, harvest, compost, manure, or any vegetation for 2 years. Livestock will have a 3-day clean out, which means you either feed them in a different pasture than what was sprayed, or in pens for 3 days before they go to someone else's place, or before they go to harvest, to slaughter. And that slaughter recommendation is only for 1 year, as opposed to going to someone else's place, which you have to carry out for 2 years after you apply Invora. Brush has to degrade on the site. And if you have a lease, you can still spray Invora, but you need to have a written lease with at least 2 years still remaining in your lease, so that you can carry out the stewardship of the chemical. So in summary, Weesatch is best to treat before trees are 7 feet tall. Bushy or multi-stem trees are going to be a lot more difficult to control. The soil temperature should be 75 degrees or higher. Maybe you can get away with spraying in the spring, but more likely we suggest you spray Weesatch in the fall, like in October timeframe. Mature leaves are best to spray, free of growth or insect damage, no flowers or beaning, and consider the rainfall. So you really want at least 2 to 3 inches 2 weeks before you spray, or you want 4 inches of rainfall at least a month before you spray Weesatch. And we also suggest coarse to very coarse droplet sizes, and that's just ensuring that you get good control of those trees, or good coverage of those trees. And then again, it's best to do a leaf herbicide application in the fall, but you always have a stem or a cut stump treatment if you want to do a little bit of cleanup during off seasons. So for our final few minutes, I'm going to talk about toxic plants and some of them that you might encounter, and why there's something that we need to be just vigilant about, but not necessarily worried about. So we know that toxic plants cause $50 to $100 million in livestock losses in Texas every year. There's about 200 plants in Texas that are toxic to livestock, but only thought to be about 80 that actually are thought to cause economic loss, or some economic disadvantage to the producer. And only about less than 4% of plants are actually toxic. And most of these plants, the animals have learned to evolve with them, and they will avoid them in most situations. The situations where they won't are, 1, naive cattle. So maybe you've brought them in from another region and they're just not used to these plants. Two, if you bring them in and they're hungry and you let them out into a pasture, they might eat a good portion of those plants before they realize that it's not making them feel very well. Or three, when you have overgrazed or pinned these animals up and they are limited in their forage availability, and so they're sort of forced to eat a lot of these plants. And keep in mind, the reason that we're covering this today too is this can occur in hayed fields too. So your hay might be baled with some toxic plants and they are still toxic in that hay. And so you may not realize if you've purchased the hay from another area or from a new producer that there are some toxic plants present. So it's something to be aware of. So some stages of plants can be more toxic than others, like broadleaf milkweeds are toxic when they're young. Silverleaf nightshade's more toxic when it's mature. Certain plant parts are more toxic, like coilteo seeds are very toxic, whereas lechugia, the entire plant is toxic. Some conditions create more toxicity, like Johnson grass, which cattle love Johnson grass, but there are certain situations where we have environmental extremes like severe drought that slows down the growth of that plant very quickly, or a freeze that slows down the growth of that plant may cause some buildup of toxins within it. And then it's toxic at that time, whereas other times it's perfectly okay. Often these toxic plants are avoided by livestock until they're forced to consume them. And most of these animals learn from their mothers what to eat or not to eat. And so that's why when they're moved to another location, you get more of those issues with the livestock just being naive to the plants that might be harmful. So most of the livestock toxic issues that we deal with can be attributed to one thing, and that's overgrazing. And so again, we've hit so many instances today of why overgrazing is bad for your property. If you need to start destocking in order to maintain good, healthy forage on your landscape, please do it, because it doesn't look like your bottom line is going to benefit in the short term, but in the long term and the health of your place, there is no thing other than good range management and being able to keep good forage on your property to help you from all different types of aspects that maybe you can't immediately put a pen and pencil to, but we know through many, many research studies that you're benefiting yourself by being a good grazing manager. So another thing to consider is, where did you feed hay this year? Hay such as cocklebur, pigweed, buffalo burr, that's all in this picture. They are hitchhiking in this imported hay. And so those are going to establish where you fed it last year. So you might want to just check those areas more readily and make sure that you're controlling any new weeds that are coming up, or get those identified to make sure that they're not toxic. So first, of course, identify the weeds in question. What do you expect to replace the weeds? So a lot of times when we do weed management, we want to get rid of our weeds, but if you don't have good established grass that's going to take the place of that, if they're not toxic, you might be better off just leaving the weeds. And then, of course, what are your goals? Are you strictly managing for livestock, or wildlife a part of your property? Because a lot of just weeds are actually beneficial for wildlife. And so if they're not harmful for your livestock, or your livestock are not being forced to eat them, then it might be a better situation just to leave them, and cheaper on your pocketbook. And then make sure you select the appropriate method according to whatever you're trying to treat. So the ideal height to treat annual weeds is actually 6 inches or less. And so at this point, a lot of us are well beyond that for our annual weeds, which means that you're going to have to use more chemical to actually control that weed. And if it's an annual weed, which means that it completes its entire life cycle, seeds out, and then it dies, it doesn't actually come back again, then if it's already seeded out and kind of done its due for the year, then you may want to just skip treating it this year and get on any of those seeds that germinate again next year earlier, because we really need to treat them early in order to be really effective. Now, our perennial weeds are different. A lot of times we allow those perennial weeds to grow a little bit and get some height to them so that you can then treat all of those leaves and have a good impact on that big root that it's grown. So you may be treating perennial weeds now, whereas annual weeds you would have treated much earlier if you've had the rainfall to be able to grow weeds this year. So what's a common necessity in order to manage these toxic plants? You have to be able to identify it to know it's a problem. One place I would send you is rangeplants.tamu.edu. That's our unit's plant database online, and it has about 400 plants in there that we're constantly updating and ways to narrow down that plant list. The Toxic Plants of Texas book, all of those plants are on this database. So if you don't buy the book, you have access to that information online too. All right. Other places you could go is My Tree ID. It's an app developed by the Forest Service, and it's free. So you might download that and see if that's helpful for you in identifying the plants or the brush species that you're having trouble with. Ag Weed ID is great if you're near farm fields, because this searches by the month, location, crop, and weed type that you're seeing. It's a very easy way to narrow down the list, and it shows plants growing in early stages, which is why I like that app. West Texas Wildflowers, or its compatible East Texas Wildflowers, has over 2,000 plants on there that you can easily narrow down by all of these characteristics. Grazing Management Toxic Plants is the only toxic plant app that I know about, and it's out of Oklahoma, but they still deal with a lot of the same toxic weeds that we have. Seek by iNaturalist is where you take a picture of the plant, and that allows you to narrow down the plants that could be. Google Lens also works very similarly and does a pretty good job. And then, of course, Best Plant ID books, if you're looking for some, or, Father's Day is coming up, might be a good chance to give your dad a book. This Range Plants of North Central Texas is a big floppy spiraled book. It's usually available from Soil and Water Conservation District offices. So check that one out. It's very good. I also love this field guide. Here's the Toxic Plants of Texas book, and it tells you not only how to identify the plant, but also how to, what livestock signs might be exhibited if it's eaten a certain percentage of that plant. And then this one, Common Woody Plants and Cacti of South Texas. It's from Amazon. I want to say it's a little higher than $16 now, but that's by far the best brush book that I've found for our area. So I'm going to skip the detailed about each one just because of a lack of time, and put up my information there. Is my email address. My website is southtexasrangelands.tamu.edu, and there's a publications tab on there that gives you a lot of the publications I mentioned today are ones that are relevant to the things we were talking about. Or on Facebook, you can check us out at Texas Range Extension. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ronnie, and I appreciate everybody attending today.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Very good information as always, whether it's weeds or brush, a lot of information. As Ashley Pellerin had placed earlier in the chat box, that we will have this available through the YouTube channel, through our AgriLife webpage, if that's correct. And because a lot of information, you can go back and review the information that was shared. Is there anybody right now that would like to ask a question now that we have Dr. Clayton still available?
Yeah, I know that was a lot of information very quickly.
Yes. But yeah, like I said, we will have this available on YouTube. So if there's no questions, if you're still on, I know it's during your lunchtime. If you all would like to go to the evaluation that's placed on your screen right now, fill that out. There's just about 10 questions. We'll give you just about a minute or two to fill this out. But Dr. Clayton, thank you very much. Good information, and I hope everybody got some information that they'll be able to at least look forward in going and spraying or doing some type of mechanical control or whatever is best needed for them. But thank you once again for being with us.